All right, good morning. So he called it a lecture, and I'm hoping that I can do a little better than that, right? I'd like to have it be more of a conversation. So if any point during this you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask. I feel better at the end of these things if there's been a good bit of engagement, then I kind of rate that as successful. Just quickly, a little bit about my background, because it flavors what I discuss, and it'll help you understand why I talk about things the way I do. So I was an infantry officer until just about a year ago when I became one of the new cyber officers. When I started my cyber career, it was in U.S. Cyber Command, where I worked offensive cyberspace operations for 2010 and 11. After that, I did some cyber support to contingency operations planning for CENTCOM. And then I led the Defend the Nation branch up at a U.S. Cyber Command, focusing on nation-state threats to our critical infrastructure and key resources. That sounds really sexy, but it was early on, so we were getting a lot of the foundational work done, not as much the nuts and bolts that the CNMF is doing today. After that, I came down to Joint Force Headquarters, and I led the CENTCOM branch for a year. Transitioned out of JFHQ to lead the Doctrine division, which has the Doctrine section and also the Lessons and Best Practice section. And I'm currently in that job. My new boss is Colonel Parker, who's the Doctrine Chief now, and I'm his deputy. So most of what I'll be discussing today is going to be a lot more on the doctrinal and the art side of defensive cyberspace operations and cybersecurity, not as much on the science side. So I'm going to talk, how we think doctrinally about defending our networks. Okay, this is the agenda for today. A couple of topics that we'll touch on. But like I said, I'm looking for engagement, so if there's something you want to ask, we can always address that as well. Okay, so first thing we got to understand, right, is that the network is the means by which the commander directs, controls, and synchronizes his forces in order to generate combat power on the battlefield. Just like General Fogarty said in his comments at the opening, this is the most, defending our networks is the most complex but most important mission that we conduct on a daily basis. Now, we've lived in an environment where we've deployed, as also General Fogarty said, the most capable network ever seen. And over the last 15 years of combat, we've operated that network without much pressure, right? So we've been operating in an uncontested environment. You can argue that it was congested, right? That some of the environment was congested, but we were not significantly contested. Well, that dynamic has now changed. We can no longer exist in the old paradigms where the most important thing for our network was availability, right? We now also have to make sure that the security of that network is equally important as the availability. So what we look at in the operating environment, right? So the operating environment has continued to increase in its technological sophistication. Almost every one of our weapons platforms and our military systems rely on some aspect of computerization, and many times are linked to the network in order to access data or pass data or to be able to function accurately. So if you think about that while you're sitting there, you'll see the truth in that, right? So even if there's systems that may not necessarily be connected to the network, they may be reliant on PNT, precision navigation and timing, right? Or they may be reliant on communications between platforms. So most of our systems somehow are linked in to DoDIN. Right, so in this congested and contested operating environment, so with the contested operating environment, it's really what we're doing is describing the battlefield, right? So we no longer have the ability to deploy our networks without having to be concerned about whether those networks are going to be attacked. We now face from our peer adversaries, a multi-layered threat, both through the electromagnetic spectrum, through cyberspace, also through space, right? So our networks are going to be constantly under pressure. Now, when we talk about congested, we're talking about the number of other actors that are out there in the same space. So as the number of commercial capabilities increase in space, space continues to become a very congested environment. On the land domain, more users now are operating in cyberspace than at any time in our history. More than half the population is online or networked in some form or fashion, right? We're using an increasing amount of the electromagnetic spectrum bandwidth. So while we are contested by our adversaries, we're also operating in this congested battle space. All right, so one of the things that our adversaries are able to do is they're able to take our increased reliance on this network and turn that as a vulnerability. Right? Those of you that are cybersecurity professionals will recognize the concept of attack surface, right? And your attack surface is larger based on the number of connections that you have external to your network. And if you think about our forces, right, our units, think about the number of external connections that we have for the purposes of communication, for the use of PNT, for linking up with other networks, right? So our attack surface is extremely broad. Now, because we have to focus on defending so broadly, right, the advantage of an attacker is always that they have to succeed in one place, whereas the defender, we have to succeed in many, right? So we've already discussed that we have this now broad attack surface, right, that increases our vulnerability, and we have very talented adversaries that now only have to succeed in a few places in defeating our defense. Adversaries have demonstrated significant capability, as you heard General Hodges talking about the Russians, right, and other briefers talking about the past experience of the Russians. They've demonstrated significant capacity for cyberspace attack. They've also demonstrated how they can, very talented in the electronic warfare field. And then most dangerously, they've demonstrated the ability to integrate those into a holistic campaign and use those types of capabilities in order to support their maneuver operations. So in the opening phase of any future conflict, especially in the European theater, we have to assume that our networks will at least be degraded and in some aspects will likely be denied, right? That's space, that's our cyberspace, and that's also our electromagnetic spectrum. The threat is that significant. In fact, I just came back a couple months ago from the Chief Staff of the Army's Unified Quest exercise where we looked at future force. And one of the messages that we gave to the Chief of Staff of the Army is you no longer have assured mission command in the opening phases of a fight. You have to assume you are going to be significantly degraded. The threat is that significant. Our attack surface is that broad. All right, so increased importance of the network. Harkening back to Major General Fogarty's comment, most complex but most important operation that we conduct on a daily basis. Now, when in the past, those of you that may have been inside the tactical force, right, the S6, right, or those are the officer that's responsible for the communications section, what was his focus or her focus? The focus was on maintaining availability of the network, right? If something went down, if say a host went down on the network, it was beating on that guy or gal until that was back up. So their answer was re-image, get it back on the network, right? Because that was the paradigm that we lived in back then. Availability, availability, availability. Well, guess what? That's not going to work anymore, right? We have to have, those of you that know CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. It used to be a really big A, little tiny C, little tiny I. Well, they have to be equal considerations now. Also, those of you that have operated inside the tactical force probably don't remember a lot of collaboration between the S6 and the S2. They typically sit in different sides of the tent, right? Well, that can't be the case anymore now either. Because we are so contested in this operating space, the S6's actions in order to defend the network, either when conducting DODN operations or DCO, must be informed by the threat. How do you know how to configure your network? You configure your network in order to counter the threat that you expect to encounter in your operation. Now, is that a proximity thing? Not necessarily, right? It may be the type of mission that you're conducting. Based on the mission you're conducting, then there's certain nation-state actors that are more interested in what you're doing and might be targeting you, right? Or if you're talking about a European theater, then obviously that geographic area, there's going to be certain actors that are going to be targeting your network. The 6 has to be coordinated with the 2 so that the 2, the intelligence officer, is providing them adversary strength and capabilities, potential signatures, TTPs, things like that, in order to inform the S6 and his staff's actions on configuring and defending that network. Right? So as you're figuring out how you're going to configure your firewalls or where you're going to deploy your sensors or those types of things, it now has to be informed by the threat. In no instance that I can envision should there ever be a network that's configured without first considering the threat that you intend to face, that you think you're facing. Now, how can I say that? Well, if you think about it in garrison, right, you may not have a specific threat that you're aware of, but there definitely is global trends, right? We can look at past year for types of attacks against DoD networks. That is still taking the threat into context. So when you're figuring out how that network's configured and what you're looking for in your logs, right, you need to do that in the context of a threat, whether it be something more broad because you're not working a specific mission at this time and you're looking at global trends against the DoD, or you're forward deployed into a theater and you have a specific adversary and you're focused on their signatures and TTPs. All right, so I'll pause there, see if there's any questions from anyone on any of that. Good? Don't be afraid to disagree with me because I may not have it all right. All right. Okay, so the maneuver force. As I mentioned, I'm an infantry officer, and this is the way I like to think of defense of our networks. In the infantry, right, when we defend a battle space, let's say that we've got this is a brigade defensive position, okay? We've got 2 battalions that are forward in their defensive positions, right? And then you've got a reserve back here, so then you've got another battalion in reserve. Who's responsible for defending this part of the line? That battalion commander, right? Does the battalion commander call back to the brigade commander and say, hey, could you come defend my line for me? No, right? That commander is responsible for defending his portion of the line, right, until he's either overwhelmed, ordered to retreat, or he regains the initiative and is ordered on the attack. That is the same. This is a perfect analogy for the way we have to approach defending our networks. The unit is responsible for defending their own network. That is their mission. Unfortunately, with some of the CSCB pilots, the cyber support to core and below pilots that we've been running at the CTCs, we've been pushing in cyber protection teams in order to demonstrate a capability. There's been some expectation by commanders of, oh, I want my CPT. No, that's not the case, right? You defend your portion of the line, and then if you are overwhelmed, well, then what do? We deploy the reserve to come in there and help you defend your position. But to the point you're overwhelmed, it is your job to defend your network.
You're using the CPTs like AWG?
Well, I would say the CP... Are you talking about right now?
Yes.
Yes, but...
To show them what right looks like.
That's right. That's correct. But that's what we call basically a capability demonstration, right? So we're trying to show the Army, here's what a cyberspace capability looks like. Because we're trying to help folks figure out how to integrate that into maneuver operations. And so we provide them those forces so they actually have them to use. But what it's important to understand is doctrinally, those CPTs are not going to come forward unless there is a significant exploitation, right? Or potentially if that network is so important that they've been ordered to do a vulnerability assessment of it, right? So my point that I keep trying to foot stomp is the defense of the network is the unit's responsibility. All right, so like we said, let's think about it this way too. So say we're still in this defensive position, right? And you've got terrain out here, right? Hilltops. You got high avenues of approach, roads coming into your defensive positions, right? Those are areas that in a maneuver example, we put ISR on, right? Or in the Army, we call it surveillance and reconnaissance. We task intelligence assets or reconnaissance assets to keep an eye on this approach so that we can see the adversary as they approach our position. It's the same thing that we utilize with our sensor deployment, right? Are we putting our sensors at the right place in our network so that we can detect incoming adversary activity? And we want to detect that activity as far left in the life cycle of the attack as possible, right? So when they're doing their initial scanning or they're establishing a foothold with initial exploitation, right? So it's important that we think about how we deploy our sensors so that we're detecting that adversary as they're coming into our networks. Again, like I said, threat focused, right? Because as you're tuning the defenses within your network, those sensors, your firewalls, right? You're going to want them to tune them to your threat. So we should be asking our, yeah, sure.
No, I think the problem, keeping the CPT reserved doesn't really lend itself to defending the enterprise because we're not doing a good job of defending the enterprise now. So all these resources that we're building up,
Sure.
and sit there and wait for stuff to happen, isn't protecting the enterprise.
So that's a great point. Do you have any idea how many Bcts we have in the Army? 32, right? 32 brigade combat teams. So really hard for us to have enough capacity to put a CPT at every brigade combat team. So what we do is, I agree that if we're not doing it well, then like any other maneuver unit, right, the higher commander may determine to push an asset forward if they've got a unit that's struggling, right? That could happen. But doctrinally, we need to put the responsibility on the unit to defend their network, and then the CPT deploys forward to deal with things that the unit is unable or uncertified to do at their level, right? Well, so if you think about it, right, so a unit can conduct DoD operations, cybersecurity, right? So they can make sure that their sensors are deployed in their network and that alerting and monitoring is being done effectively. They can review the logs. They can modify firewalls, update ACL lists, right? There's a lot of actions that can be taken at that level that can address a large percent of an attack, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I was thinking about the context of forward deployed operations versus more of a centralized capability that you have access to however you have SIM architecture configured, both joint force headquarters or some element of cyber command that's supporting it. And I think if you look at what capabilities you can bring to bear from the centralized command and control versus what the units have to deal with in forward operations, that may help them understand what warfighting capabilities from a cyber perspective they have to best address that.
Yeah, great. And we'll actually, when we get to later in the slide deck, we'll talk about IAD's installation as a docking station. We'll talk about what potential use that has to help units train. So I don't disagree with you that it may be appropriate at times if units are struggling to push those CPTs forward in the fight. But think about it from a perspective of as you're training soldiers and you're training subordinate leaders and units, you don't want to train them to rely on that asset. You want to train them to conduct the fight at their level, right? And then we bring that forward. So we're conscious in our messaging, right, that those forces will be available to support when needed. But we want the units to get to the position where they can do the majority of the workload on their own. Because think about if we go to fight the Russians, right? We go to that scenario. How much exploitations do you think we're going to have? I mean, it's going to be pretty broad and extensive, right? So there's going to be a significant decision at higher levels on prioritization and where they deploy that very limited asset, right? So we just don't want commanders to get in the habit of expecting or counting on that CPT. We want them to get in the habit of training their forces to do the most they can at their level. That's my way.
The only problem I would have is that with that analogy, that unit, that organization has the resources and capabilities, right? They have soldiers, they have tanks, they have equipment, they have conventional arms. There's not an organic CME cybersecurity capability. A lot of that comes out high. Like they just build up. You have one or two
I see both of you. I'll get to you. This gentleman had his hand up first. No, that's cool. No, I want to have the... Okay, good. This is. Please don't hold back on the comments. I like the engagement.
We are actually slowly getting the organic component. The 25 deltas will be pushed out of ForceCom as a C&D section at brigade level. Not all three of us here are up at 82nd Airborne Division. I just came from 1st Bct.
Can you hear his comment? So what he's telling is these guys are 25 deltas, right? Some of the individuals that are specifically responsible for cybersecurity at the brigade combat team level. So they're on the way out the door.
It's just slowly getting there.
And do you know why? Do you know why it's slow? Where did they go first? Yeah, they all went to the CMF, right? There was a leadership decision that we're going to fill out the cyber mission force, and then we're going to the tactical force. So we're at the pivot point now where most of the CMF is healthy, and you're starting to see some of these low-density MOSs flowing down to units. Master Sergeant, did you have anything to add?
Right, sir. So even as the 25 Delta student concierge has been trickling out to the BCT level, a lot of units have had organic CNDSP personnel, but they don't actually have that expertise. They have these monitoring tools, but they don't have the analysis training to use them effectively. They're just a tool to ignore things more efficiently. So as a stopgap, we need to train those CNDSP personnel on how to do that job. And the CPTs are well placed to do that, but there's been a lot of pushback on being trainers, saying that's not our job. Well, if we're not doing it, who is?
Yeah, so I think we need to continue to get that kind of feedback, right? Through we introduced you our lessons and best practices guys yesterday. We are anxious to get that type of information because we work very closely with Colonel Edmondson, the Signal Commandant, to provide him and his staff that kind of input on, hey, here are specific topics that need to be addressed in the POI because our guys and gals on the field are not able to execute their mission when they hit the ground. Now, I'm not going to try to fool you, make you think it's easy to get, POIs updated quickly, right? But we got to get it started. What we've identified is there's ways we can update the POI in small increments, which doesn't trigger a rewrite of the POI, which is a long, deliberate process. There was another hand back here. Do we answer, or do you still got it? Absolutely. I think that, okay, go ahead.
I think it's at an even more abstract level. We don't even give our maneuver commanders the authority to control and maintain their network now. We can't delineate who the AO is to direct responsibility for maneuvering in or on the domain. So, that's great if you have 25 deltas. What's he authorized to do with them? It's nothing. It's similar to managing the city assets. Until we figure out that, I think we have some struggles ahead of us.
Go ahead.
I see very close parallels to SIGINT assets we had. Where we had high demand, low density, you can't really train in garrison, and all your guys are laying under trucks at the motor pool filling out 24-4s instead of staying on the edge of what they're doing.
And what did we do to fix that, though?
Unfortunately, what we had to do was we had to push from a national level. We had to push out CSTs and Jester teams to actually provide the support. We couldn't have at the ForceCom level because they couldn't stay bleeding edge with all the other requirements.
And we pushed out and we created fusion cells, right, where we let the people do the mission in garrison, right, is backside support for deployed forces. So I wanted to jump to this, right, because it sounded like everyone is kind of moving towards this. This is installation as a docking station. This is a concept that is actually in practice with several units within ForceCom at this time. What installation as a docking station allows you to do is it allows a unit to basically plug into DODN, but have the responsibility for managing their network instead of having that rely at the local NEC, right? So units have the ability to plug into an edge at the NEC, connect to the DODN, and then conduct their own cybersecurity for their BCS stacks, basically. Right? Some units are doing this. Some are not, right? So what we've been looking at with the Signal Commandant and ForceCom is, can we get to a position where we mandate this? And what it really is you stand up your tactical network in garrison, right, so that you can take your folks and as a daily mission, they can be conducting their DODN operations cybersecurity mission, right? There's no better place for you to get the time to train your young soldiers on their mission than in garrison, because they're not as contested. There's not the stress of the being deployed in the operating environment, right? And this is a great time to work on SOPs and TTPs. I'll tell you another small analogy. Before I deployed to Iraq as a company commander, when I was in the 82nd, we were concerned about, whether or not the soldiers were going to have negligent discharges, right? Because, they don't have their weapons all the time. And so what we said is, all right, 30 days out, we draw weapons every day. Guys walked around with weapons, with magazines in it. They did load clear, reduced stoppage, reflexive fire every day, 30 days before we deployed. Those soldiers got so comfortable with their weapons, right, that we had no negligent discharges in the entire deployment. The only company in the brigade that did not have a weapons-related issue. So, like that, we feel that IADS potentially offers an opportunity for units to operate their tactical networks in garrison and work through their cybersecurity roles and responsibilities. So you can take those young soldiers that don't have the experience and teach them how to configure or review logs. You can talk about sensor deployment or troubleshooting, things like that, and work that out before you deploy. Now, this is an option that's available to all units, right? There's a process that is laid out on the ForceCom G6 portal, as well as the NetCom portal, and there's a white paper describing this that was written by NetCom, and also the CPB is very experienced at this concept. So this is available to units. We advocate heavily that units do this, because what we don't want to have happen is when they deploy to JRTC, NTC, you pull your stacks out of the ISU and, right, you blow the dust off of it and you find out the patches are a year and a half old, right? And you end up deploying on a system that's much less secure and you're not necessarily as familiar with. Any questions about IADS? Yep.
So when we encourage IADS, we're having the units scan and patch the system as part of the maintenance, are we now encouraging the return of shadow zones, where units are now training their ability next in their brigade headquarters?
Well, I think so, or something like that, right? Because we're basically establishing the NOSC, right? The Brigade NOSC, the Network Operations Security Center. So that's a role that we expect them to execute when they're deployed. So the idea is that we allow them to execute that in a garrison environment and professionalize their force on that. So I think, yes, I think you asked it from there were some negative connotations to it. Not being an experience, having many years background of that, I'm not aware of that. But in the concept, yes, we want to basically put them in the field, right, from garrison. Yep.
The Army went to great lengths to close down all those shadow zones and consolidate all the necks. We're now in an installation-based neck. We want to consolidate further to a regionalized neck. But I think now we're encouraging people to sprout those little necks to get under the desk.
Well, think about it, right? So what's the whole concept, the main core of our defensive strategy of our networks? It's layered, right? So I think that what we want to encourage is that we have cybersecurity and DCO actions occurring at each layer, right? That's part of the reason we spend so much time on making sure that we've got HBSS and ACAS and ESM configured so that we're alerting and monitoring, especially with HBSS, so that we're enabling that next tier to look at what's going on in the network and potentially alert and respond to those issues. Sure. Yes, sir.
I think, back to your question. I think if I'm getting at your question right, I don't think we're asking you to stand up your own network internally. So if you remember prior enterprise email, everybody, at confidentiality, I don't know, whatever it was. So we're not asking you to stand up your own network to allow your forces to connect to doing that with the next, utilizing that. I think what we're saying with this system is allowing your 255, your 25 Bravos, who would be operating your servers, the switches, your systems, to have them current and to work through those issues with standing up HPSS, Veritest, things like that, so they're familiar with it. So when they do deploy, they'll provide that defense to depth, okay, as part of a bigger network on the enterprise system. So I don't think we're asking you to run your own enterprise services, to be able to be connected on that and be familiar with your systems like that.
The gentleman in the white shirt's been waiting for a second. Go ahead.
So I don't disagree with any of that. I just think we're wasting IaaS if we're only putting stuff on the network to patch it. So, as we move to BCCS V5 and TSI and all these other aspects of the network, they have to be on the network all the time. So if a battalion wants to roll out and the brigade commander wants to conduct training, he needs the division repo on the network to send his troops out to conduct, whatever they want to do out in the field. We don't use it that way. We don't train our operators that way. And we need to start looking at it more holistically. As IaaS isn't just there to patch and maintain services.
No.
It is there to train the force.
Yeah, to extend services.
And what that should allow you to do is if it's current on the system, you'll be able to unplug that, go out to the packing environment, plug it back in, and execute. And so, unfortunately, it's not a centralized process, as you know, but I'll tell you, Central Walls, every time Fort Ward had the three command corps, 506 level, G6s, Sergeant Majors, we briefed them on this. And we tell them about this capability, so they're more educated, so hopefully when they get back out to your locations, hopefully they execute something.
So I don't disagree with any of that. I just think we're plagued by, we're amateurs at every job we walk into. And right when you get it, you're moving out the door. If we're telling our G6s that's great. It's our brigade S6s that need to know, hey, brigade commander, let me tell you what I can do for you today. You want to send the battalion out to fire? Let's put our stuff on the network. We can be here in home station, plus now we're calling home station mission command.
So you're saying Brigade 6 is the audience that you think we ought to target to sell this to?
Yeah, I think they're important. Colonel Edwards, I think, was enhanced those 6 months of training with the team because he was one of the BCT commanders and ILD forces that led the senior sectors. So he took those as part of what he was talking about. Every BCT commanding force of the BCT
Yeah, we're catching up to our own developmental process here, right? We got IaaS, we put stuff on the network. What's the next step? How do we exploit something we're currently doing for ourselves to enable the commander?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you are aware of how we are envisioning the future force, we no longer make the assumption that we'll employ the entire headquarters forward. We intend to utilize Home Station Mission Command. So a unit's proficiency at maintaining their tactical networks from garrison can enable speed of deployment in a Home Station Mission Command model.
I will tell you the last example that this first up is what they do before has instituted IaaS, and they routinely send out small teams. But we just use IaaS for the Home Station Command Center has turned it around so that he's got 24-hour access to the units out there to provide all the engineering and everything else.
Sure. Yes, sir.
What was the goal of the IaaS, and what is it actually accomplishing? Where I'm trying to figure out the gap.
So the goal was it allowed the units to employ their tactical networks while in garrison, right? So the SIGINT folks, as we were talking about earlier, right, the Army G2 used to have a term saying no SIGINT analyst at rest. That's why they created the Fusion Center, so that when they came off mission, they went to the Fusion Center and they supported mission for forward deploy units. They're looking something along that lines for no network at rest, right, where your network is constantly operating. So if we're bad at something, what's the way? I mean, those of you guys and gals that have grown up in sports, right? If you're bad at something, what do? You do it 1,000 times, right, until you get good at it. Same thing, if we are challenged at defending our networks, we need to do it as a daily mission, not only when we deploy to a CTC or we go on a deployment. So the concept was that we were finding a way to enable units to deploy their networks full-time from a garrison environment, so that when there was less of that learning curve or less of that maintenance or update required when they had a deployment timeline. Now, folks are using it. Yep. That's right. And so units have utilized it all the way from the level of some that are just doing patching, right? It's keeping them patched, all the way to units like the 51st that have fully deployed it and are using it for mission command. There has not been a directive for units to do this. It has been an opportunity that's been afforded, and some units have done it to a low extent, and some of them have fully taken it on board.
So just understanding it from the HBSS context, where you have an ETO,
yep.
each one of them have an enclave. Do you have the tool set to give you visibility of the enclave?
So they have HBSS, right, which populates the EPO servers at the RCC, and then also the RCyber coaxes, right? ACAS units also have ACAS and ESM. The security onion suite that the CPB likes is not available to units yet. That is a CMF toolkit, but we're going through the process through Tickham Cyber to get it approved so that we can get that down to the force, because it's been recognized as an excellent toolkit. So yes, there are some limited tools available. There are tools available to the tactical forces.
So you would use that tool set that you just described.
That's right.
Push it out.
Because what's one of the hardest things those of you that deployed to a CTC rotation from the S6, one of the hardest things you're doing in RSOI is getting HBSS configured, right? Making sure all your hosts are showing up and that everything's getting back to the EPO server. You'll spend days on that, right? But that is like a critical element of our tiered defensive strategy. If I'm not alerting and monitoring higher, I don't have a tiered defense, right? So that's a great example of where the IADS can increase that competency on a core task like that. And then now you just roll into the box. It's just secondhand, Think about frequency hop, That used to be like that for us. Now units trying to establish a frequency hop network, it's like I'm sorry, that was going to be vulgar. There's not a good analogy, right? They mess with it a lot. I was thinking of the monkey one. All right. Anything else on IADS? Yes, please.
I was thinking, and I think there are efforts going forward this way. I guess the grand compromise would be units who didn't want to sit there and bring their actual units online into the domain, using what the term is cyber ratings, to be able to go in
Okay.
and still be able to exercise those skill sets against virtualized, simulated tools and entities, so that.
So we are working at the Cyber COE. There is an ongoing effort to establish a persistent training environment, right? That's being run under Tickham Cyber. I'll tell you something that our guys have found when they've been out in the field, though, is that some of these CCOM universities, which are training installations or training facilities at each major installation and base, where they provide training basically at cost. Many of those facilities have existing virtual ranges. The one here at Gordon is really good, where we can configure either a host or a virtual network and then go in and execute typical vulnerability assessment or cybersecurity type missions. So we can utilize those to get some individual and maybe like team level competency. You're not going to drop a battalion on that, right? But you can put a handful of dudes or a group of dudes on that and train some of those cybersecurity tasks. Now, units have to actually go out and pay for that, right? And they have to make white space on their calendar and allow the commo guys to come off police call to go do that. Any other questions on this? I'm going to jump back to the other slide quickly and see if there's any topics that we missed. Let's jump in this last part, role of CPT, since that generated some discussion. So like we said, we look at that as being an asset held higher that's deployed forward when required based on priorities. All right, so if you think about fires, you have MLRS, that's a core asset, right? Does a battalion ever get MLRS support? Yeah, sometimes when they're main effort or the main effort, right? So it will be an asset that will be retained at a higher level that will be deployed forward based on priorities and requirement. Now, we say deployed, what's that mean? Well, there's on-site and there's remote operations. The gold or the brass ring for us is remote operations, but unfortunately our networks aren't fully configured to enable remote operations down to the Bct level yet. Right? We are working towards that. I think that's a critical element of JIE. I'm not sure. I'm not on the engineering side. But what we intend to do is we deploy the teams forward as far forward as required. So depending on what the exploitation is, it may be required for us to do advanced forensics on the actual host, and we got to go all the way to the unit, right? Or it may be where we can deploy forward to the RCC, and from the RCC have access extended into the network to be able to do our mission. Or in the best case, for us to be able to do it from Sanctuary, right? Because by being able to be a little bit farther back, you can engage and support more broadly. Again, as an infantryman, when you enter in, you think about enter and clear a room, right? You got whatever's right there in front of you, and you can engage just those targets you can see because they're right up on top of you. But the further you back out, right, there's more targets that you can engage. So similar thing, the further down we get the CPTs engaged, the more difficult it is to move them laterally or have them support multiple efforts at once. CPTs, when they were designed with a certain configuration, but they are task organizable based on mission requirements. In few instances will you ever see an entire CPT pick up, get on a plane together, and land. And it'll be, hey, I need this capability, that capability, that capability, team of 6, leadership element, boom, you're out the door. So it'll be configured based on mission requirements. When and why, I know I haven't sold my guys over here on this side, but it's when there's a significant exploitation, right, that puts the larger network at risk, or when you may be doing a vulnerability assessment in advance of an exploitation of a critical network. So think something like maybe the theater integrated air defense system, or the air operations network, or the mission command network for the CJTF, right? Great examples of where you might want to have a team come in and do a focused vulnerability assessment to help harden that network. All right, so we're dialing down there on the end of the hour. I think we're probably at it. So any questions on, I'll jump back just so you see what we went through. Talked about the operating environment. Talked about our strategy for network defense in depth. Talked a good bit about IADS. So any remaining questions out there or concerns that someone wants to voice? All right, I'll put a pitch in. Yeah, go ahead. What's up, Sergeant? Mm-hmm.
How are we connecting? So if the Bcts, are they going to be using SATCOM?
So I wanted to, I wished I had it. There's another document that you should look at. It's called TRIPS. It was written by the 7th Signal Command, I believe. And it talks about the 2 different methods that you can plug in for IADS. So they could get an edge coming straight off the neck, one of their edge routers, and plug into it that way, and then they follow the same path as if you were having services extended through the neck. Or I think they can plug into the RCC, right, through a regional hub node.
That's what Bitford is actually voice over services.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. This is Juan. I just came from 25th. We have ISF kind of set up for 5-6 years now, even before the construct, the official construct came out. But to answer your question, the initial path out to the land and go to the SATCOM pieces in there. That's all that is your unit hub node at the division level, tying into the net. We have to park our trucks behind the net. And then when our units go to the field, at that time, they access satellite, the birds, the SAs, coming to the network. So that's not an always-on solution, reference to SATCOM. But the pipe out to the world is always on. And you're using the garrison infrastructure to get it out to your building sets in garrison, to your brigades, battalions, whatever.
All right.
And what we did is our brigades mandated that they put service pops, basically, inside our garrison, inside a consolidated service room, basically. Tactical stats sitting in there, so all our brigades at any point that we pull out, or if I got a battalion from Brigade X, they're going out to the field to fire. They can reach back through their CPN to an always-on division repo, brigade repo, XYZ, and then also the defense in depth is there because CND at the division level as well as whatever small CND they're doing at the battalion or brigade level is always available as well. But hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you after that, Chief. That's some good information. So last thing I'll tell you is if you got ideas on how we can do this better or observations from the force, please, you can relay it to me, or I'd ask you to write down a name, Mr. Rick San Miguel, right, or Mr. Mike Terry. Both those you can find on the Global Access list. Please drop us a note because we are trying to be a learning organization as we help inform the institutional side of the Army. So I appreciate your time. Hopefully that was beneficial to you in one way or another. And I'll hang around for a few minutes if anyone has questions. Thanks.